The pool demolition hammer froze mid-swing as sirens wailed down Maple Street. Marcus Chen's heart hammered against his ribs. 20 minutes ago, he was just a homeowner fixing a drainage problem. Now flashing red and blue lights painted his driveway like a crime scene. Through his kitchen window, Karen Whitmore's silhouette stood rigid behind her curtains, phone still pressed to her ear, her lips curved in a satisfied smile. The lead officer's hand rested on his holster as he approached, and Marcus realized, with cold dread, that his simple afternoon project had somehow become something far more dangerous. What Karen had told them would either destroy his life forever or expose a truth that would shatter the entire neighborhood. Marcus Chen had always prided himself on being the kind of neighbor people wanted living next door. In the 3 years since he'd bought the modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street, he'd maintained his lawn with military precision, kept his music at reasonable volumes, and even organized the annual block party that brought the whole neighborhood together each summer. So when he noticed the water pooling in his backyard after the recent heavy rains, creating a muddy swamp that threatened his foundation, Marcus did what any responsible homeowner would do. He researched the problem, got the necessary permits, and prepared to fix it himself. The above-ground pool had seemed like such a good idea when he'd installed it 2 years ago. Sarah had loved floating in it during her weekend visits, their 8-year-old daughter splashing and laughing in ways that made the messy divorce almost worth it if it meant she was happy. But now, with Sarah remarried and living in California, and Emma only visiting during school holidays, the pool had become more liability than luxury. "It's got to go," Marcus muttered to himself as he stood in his backyard that crisp October morning, surveying the soggy ground. The pool's base had shifted during the recent storm, creating an uneven foundation that was directing rainwater straight toward his house. Left unchecked, it would cause thousands in foundation damage. He'd spent the previous evening reviewing the city permits online, double-checking the regulations for pool removal. Everything was in order. He owned the property. The pool wasn't permanent infrastructure, and he had every right to remove it. The drainage issue made it not just a choice, but a necessity. Marcus had taken 2 weeks of vacation time from his job at the engineering firm specifically for this project. He'd rented the proper equipment, studied YouTube tutorials until his eyes burned, and mapped out every step of the process. By his calculations, he could have the pool dismantled, the area leveled and reseeded within a week. What he hadn't calculated was Karen Whitmore. Karen lived in the pristine white colonial, directly to his right, a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of Better Homes and Gardens. Every shrub was perfectly trimmed, every flower bed obsessively maintained, every window sparkling clean. She was the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, the first to notice when someone's trash cans sat too long on the curb or when a lawnmower pattern wasn't quite straight. Marcus had learned to coexist with Karen's particular brand of vigilance. She'd approached him exactly twice in 3 years, once to inform him that his delivery truck was parked 3 inches over the property line, and once to suggest he consider a more aesthetically pleasing mailbox design. He'd handled both interactions with polite deference, making the requested changes without argument. But this morning, as Marcus wheeled the rented excavator down his driveway, he could feel Karen's eyes boring into him from her kitchen window. The intensity of her stare made the hair on his neck stand up. He tried to ignore it. After all, what he was doing was perfectly legal and entirely within his rights as a property owner. The pool removal would actually improve the neighborhood's appearance. The current setup, with standing water and mud, was hardly attractive. Marcus had just finished setting up his equipment when he heard the sharp tap of heels on concrete. Karen was marching across her driveway toward the property line, her silver hair pulled back in its usual severe bun, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured authority that Marcus had learned to recognize. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Marcus straightened up from where he'd been checking the excavator's hydraulic lines. "Morning, Karen, just doing some landscaping work." Landscaping work? Her eyes narrowed as she took in the heavy equipment, the pile of tools, the obvious scope of the project. "This looks like construction to me, major construction. It's pool removal," Marcus explained patiently. "The drainage is causing problems with my foundation, so I need to take it down and level the area." Karen's expression shifted from suspicion to outright alarm. "Pool removal? You can't just tear down structures without proper permits. There are regulations about this sort of thing. Environmental concerns, noise ordinances." Marcus felt his patience beginning to fray, but he kept his voice level. "I have all the necessary permits, Karen. Everything's been properly filed with the city." "I find that hard to believe." Karen crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture that somehow made her look both smaller and more intimidating. "Major structural changes require neighbor notification, environmental impact studies. You can't just wake up one morning and decide to tear apart your property." "It's an above-ground pool," Marcus said, pointing to the obvious aluminum structure. "It's not permanent infrastructure. I have every legal right to remove it." But Karen wasn't listening. She was already pulling her phone from her purse, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the screen. "We'll just see about that," she muttered. Marcus watched with growing unease as Karen retreated to her house, phone pressed to her ear. Through her kitchen window, he could see her pacing back and forth, gesticulating wildly as she spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line. He tried to shake off his concern. Karen was being Karen, dramatic, overbearing, convinced. That every minor change in the neighborhood was a personal affront to her vision of suburban perfection. She'd made her call, probably to some city department that would confirm he had the proper permits, and that would be the end of it. Marcus fired up the excavator and got to work. The first phase involved draining the remaining water from the pool. Even though he'd stopped using it weeks ago, recent rains had left several inches of murky water in the bottom. He'd rented a pump for this purpose, and the steady thrum of the motor was oddly soothing as he watched the water level drop. It was while he was monitoring the pump that he noticed Karen had returned to her kitchen window. She was no longer alone. A man in a dark suit had joined her, and they were both staring intently at Marcus's work. The man was taking notes in a small pad, occasionally pointing at different aspects of Marcus's setup. A cold knot formed in Marcus's stomach. That wasn't a city inspector making a routine follow-up call. That was someone official, someone with authority, someone who'd responded to whatever story Karen had spun. Marcus forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He had permits. He had rights. Whatever Karen had told this official would be easily resolved once the man saw the proper documentation. But even as he tried to reassure himself, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Karen's body language wasn't that of someone filing a routine complaint. She was animated, urgent, pointing repeatedly at his equipment and gesturing toward his house with what looked like genuine alarm. What could she possibly be telling them? The pump finished its work, and Marcus began the next phase, disconnecting the pool's filtration system. This required cutting through several thick hoses and removing the pump housing, work that produced a series of loud mechanical sounds that echoed across the quiet suburban morning. Each clang and hiss seemed to agitate Karen further. Through the window, Marcus could see her pointing more frantically, her conversation with the suited man growing more animated. At one point, she stepped outside and took several photos of Marcus's work with her phone, holding it at angles that made the perfectly legal pool removal look as dramatic and destructive as possible. Marcus was beginning to understand that this wasn't about permits or noise ordinances. This was about control. Karen had appointed herself the neighborhood's guardian, and Marcus's decision to make a major change without consulting her first had triggered something deeper than mere disapproval. He'd seen this kind of escalation before, back when he was married, and Sarah had dealt with a similar neighbor in their previous home. Some people couldn't tolerate the idea that others might make decisions independently, especially decisions that changed the familiar landscape of their daily lives. But understanding Karen's psychology didn't make the situation any less dangerous. The man in her kitchen wasn't just a city inspector. Marcus was becoming increasingly certain of that. The way Karen was speaking to him, the urgency in her gestures, the careful notes he was taking, all suggested someone with more serious authority, as eyes. Marcus began dismantling the pool's aluminum frame. The metallic scraping and clanking seemed to reach some kind of threshold for Karen. She disappeared from the window entirely, leaving the suited man alone. Minutes later, Marcus saw her emerge from her front door and march down the street. Phone once. Officer Daniel Reeves had been a cop for 17 years, long enough to recognize the difference between a legitimate emergency call and neighborhood drama blown out of proportion. But as he stepped out of his cruiser and surveyed the scene, at 1247 Maple Street, he couldn't immediately tell which category this fell into. The Asian man standing in the front yard looked more confused than dangerous. Hands visible, posture non-threatening, expression genuinely bewildered. Behind him, what appeared to be a partially dismantled above-ground pool sat surrounded by neat piles of aluminum framing and professional-grade equipment. Everything about the scene suggested routine home improvement work, but the call that had brought Reeves and 5 other officers racing across town had been anything but routine. "Are you Marcus Chen?" Reeves asked, his hand still resting on his weapon out of habit more than immediate concern. "Yes, sir." Marcus's voice was steady, but Reeves could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting between the multiple officers spreading out across his property. "Is there some kind of problem?" Before Reeves could answer, Karen Whitmore emerged from her house like she'd been waiting for her cue. She moved across her pristine lawn with purposeful strides, her phone clutched in one hand and a manila folder thick with papers in the other. "Thank God you're here," she called out, her voice carrying the particular breathlessness of someone who'd convinced herself she was the hero of her own drama. "I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He's been at it for hours." Reeves held up a hand. "Ma'am, let me speak with Mr. Chen first, then I'll get your statement." But Karen was already talking, the words spilling out in a rush. "He's destroying evidence. That's what this is really about. He thinks if he tears down the pool fast enough, no one will be able to prove what he did." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "Evidence? What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Karen snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "We all heard the screaming last month. We all saw the ambulance. And now, conveniently, you're tearing down the exact spot where it happened." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Last month, the ambulance. His mind raced back to that terrible evening in September when Emma had been visiting for the weekend. His daughter had been playing in the pool when she'd slipped on the wet aluminum ladder, falling hard and hitting her head on the pool's edge. The gash had bled terrifiously, as head wounds do, and Emma's screams of pain and terror had probably carried across half the neighborhood. Marcus had called 911 immediately, riding with Emma to the hospital where she'd received 12 stitches and a concussion protocol. It had been the most frightening night of his life, but Emma had recovered completely. She'd even joked about her battle scar during their video calls since then, but apparently Karen had constructed an entirely different narrative around that night. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled, "my daughter had an accident in the pool last month. She slipped and cut her head. I called the ambulance myself." "Your daughter," Karen said, her tone dripping with manufactured skepticism. The daughter who hasn't been seen in the neighborhood since that night. How convenient. Officer Reeves was beginning to understand the situation, and he didn't like it. False accusations of child abuse were among the most destructive calls he handled. They destroyed lives even when proven unfounded, and they wasted resources that could be used for real emergencies. "Mr. Chen," he said, "do you have documentation of your daughter's hospital visit?" Of course. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through his photos to find the selfie Emma had insisted on taking in her hospital bed, grinning despite her bandaged head. "She was treated at Riverside General. Dr. Martinez handled her case." Karen's eyes flashed with something that looked like panic. "Photos can be faked. Hospital records can be manipulated. But physical evidence, that's harder to hide." "What? Physical evidence?" Reeves asked, though he was starting to suspect Karen didn't have any. "The pool!" Karen gestured wildly toward the dismantled structure. "He's destroying the scene. If something happened to that little girl, there would be traces, DNA evidence, signs of struggle, and he's systematically eliminating every piece of it." Marcus stared at Karen in horror. She wasn't just making false accusations. She was constructing an elaborate conspiracy theory that painted him as some kind of methodical criminal. "Karen, this is insane. Emma is fine. She's in California with her mother. I can call her right now." "Can you?" Karen's smile was cold, calculating. "Or will you just put on another performance like you've been doing for months?" Officer Martinez, Reeves's partner, had been quietly documenting the scene with his camera. Now he approached with a concerned expression. "Dan, we need to talk." They stepped aside, leaving Marcus under the watchful eye of the other officers. Karen remained planted in her front yard like a sentinel, clutching her folder of evidence. "What's your read?" Reeves asked quietly. Martinez glanced back at Karen, then at Marcus. "Honestly, this feels like a neighbor dispute that got way out of hand. The guy seems genuinely confused, and his story about the hospital visit checks out. I can see the photo from here, and it looks legit. But we've got a citizen making serious allegations. Child endangerment, evidence tampering, possible homicide. We can't just walk away without investigating." Reeves knew Martinez was right, even though every instinct told him this was a waste of time. In the current climate, any report involving potential child abuse had to be taken seriously, no matter how questionable the source. "We'll need to verify the daughter is safe," Reeves decided. "Contact the ex-wife, check the hospital records, maybe bring in CPS for a welfare check." As they returned to the group, Karen was presenting her folder to one of the other officers, like she was delivering a legal brief. "I've documented everything," she was saying. "Dates, times, suspicious activities. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for." Marcus felt sick. Whatever was in that folder, Karen had been planning this moment for weeks, possibly months. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to his pool removal. It was a calculated attack that she'd been building toward. "Mrs. Whitmore," Officer Reeves said formally, "I'm going to need you to walk me through your specific concerns." Karen's posture straightened like she'd been waiting her entire life for this question. "It started about 6 months ago. Mr. Chen's behavior became erratic, paranoid. He installed security cameras pointing at our property. Those cameras are pointed at my own driveway," Marcus interrupted. "I installed them after my car was vandalized. And he began having loud arguments at all hours, screaming matches that would go on for hours." Marcus's confusion deepened. "I live alone. Who would I be arguing with?" "Exactly," Karen said triumphantly. "That's what made it so disturbing. He would be out in his backyard, shouting at someone who wasn't there, threatening behavior, violent language." The pieces suddenly clicked into place for Marcus. 6 months ago, he'd started having regular video calls with Emma, who was struggling with the divorce and the cross-country move. Their conversations often involved him pacing the backyard while talking her through her problems, sometimes raising his voice to be heard over poor cell reception, occasionally expressing anger about Sarah's new husband or the custody arrangement. To someone watching from a distance, without context, it might have looked like he was having heated arguments with invisible people. "Officer," Marcus said desperately, "I can explain all of this. My daughter has been having a hard time with the divorce. We talk on video chat several times a week. The poor cell reception in my backyard means I sometimes have to raise my voice. But Karen was ready for this. That's his story now. But I have dates, times, recordings of his threatening behavior, and then came that night in September." She opened her folder and pulled out what appeared to be a handwritten timeline, complete with timestamps and detailed descriptions. Marcus glimpsed phrases like child screams, suspicious disposal activity, and evidence of struggle. "The child was in distress," Karen continued, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this speech. "Screaming for help. I heard her crying, 'Daddy, stop!' multiple times before the screaming suddenly stopped." Marcus's world tilted. Emma had indeed been crying and calling for him. She'd been terrified by the blood and pain from her accident. But in Karen's twisted retelling, his daughter's cries for comfort had become evidence of abuse. "Then came the cleanup," Karen went on. "Hours of activity in the backyard, moving things around, the sound of scrubbing. And when the ambulance arrived, there was no child." "Because she was already in my car," Marcus shouted. "I drove her to meet the ambulance at the end of the street because I was panicking and didn't want to wait." But Officer Reeves was looking at Karen's timeline with growing concern. However delusional her interpretation might be, she'd clearly been documenting Marcus's activities with obsessive detail. From a law enforcement perspective, it looked like the kind of evidence log that could support serious charges. "Mr. Chen," Reeves said carefully, "I'm going to need you to come to the station for questioning. This is not an arrest, but we need to verify some information before we can close this investigation." Detective Sarah Walsh had seen enough false accusations in her 15-year career to recognize the warning signs. But the Marcus Chen case was presenting complications she hadn't anticipated. As she reviewed the initial reports in interview, Room B at the 12th precinct, the inconsistencies in Karen Whitmore's story were glaring. Yet the woman's obsessive documentation created an unsettling foundation that couldn't be easily dismissed. Marcus sat across from her, still in handcuffs. Despite his cooperative demeanor, his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres, taking notes on a legal pad. The man looked exhausted, bewildered, and genuinely frightened, which in Walsh's experience usually indicated innocence. Guilty parties typically presented with either aggressive defensiveness or calculated calm. "Mr. Chen," Walsh began, "I want to be clear that you're not under arrest at this time. However, we have received serious allegations that require investigation." "What allegations, specifically?" Torres interjected. "My client has a right to know exactly what he's being accused of." Walsh consulted her notes. "Potential child endangerment, evidence tampering, and—" She paused, knowing how ridiculous the next part would sound. "Possible homicide." Marcus's face went white. "Homicide? My daughter is alive. She's in California with her mother. I can prove it." "We're working on verification," Walsh said. "But Mrs. Whitmore has provided extensive documentation suggesting otherwise." She spread Karen's materials across the table. The handwritten timeline, photographs of Marcus's backyard taken from various angles, and what appeared to be audio recordings made from Karen's property. The sheer volume of surveillance material was staggering. "She's been watching me for months," Marcus said, staring at the evidence with growing horror. "This isn't concerned neighbor behavior, this is stalking." Torres leaned forward. "Detective, has my client been read his Miranda rights?" "This is still an investigative interview," Walsh replied. "But given the seriousness of the allegations, Mr. Chen, I recommend you consider everything you say carefully." The interview room door opened, and Detective Mike Gonzalez entered with, a thick file folder. Walsh's partner had been making verification calls while she conducted the preliminary interview, and his expression suggested he'd uncovered significant information. "Can I speak with you outside?" Gonzalez asked. The detectives stepped into the hallway, leaving Marcus and Torres to confer in low voices. "What did you find?" Walsh asked. Gonzalez opened his folder. "It's complicated. The daughter, Emma Chen, is definitely alive. I spoke with her directly at her mother's house in California. She confirmed the pool accident, showed me her stitches over video chat, the whole thing." Walsh felt a mixture of relief and frustration. So this is exactly what it looks like, a false accusation from an obsessive neighbor. That's where it gets weird. Gonzalez pulled out a photograph. "I also spoke with the ex-wife, Sarah Chen Morrison. She's been trying to reach Marcus for 3 days. Apparently, Emma was supposed to fly back for a visit this weekend, but Marcus never confirmed the travel arrangements." Walsh studied the photograph, a recent school picture of a smiling 8-year-old girl with Marcus's eyes and chin. Maybe he forgot to respond to an email? Maybe. Or maybe Mrs. Whitmore's surveillance turned up something we're not seeing yet. Gonzalez flipped through more pages. "I've got the hospital records from Emma's accident. Everything checks out. 12 stitches, concussion protocol, treated by Dr. Martinez just like Chen said. Then what's the problem? The problem is that Mrs. Whitmore's timeline includes activities that allegedly occurred after the hospital visit. According to her notes, Marcus was in his backyard until nearly 3 a.m. that night, doing what she describes as extensive cleanup activity." Walsh frowned. "People clean up after accidents. Blood, medical supplies, whatever. For 7 hours? That gave Walsh pause. She'd worked enough crime scenes to know that extensive cleanup after a traumatic event was sometimes a sign of something more sinister than accident management. But it could also indicate someone who was obsessive-compulsive, traumatized, or simply thorough. "There's more," Gonzalez continued. "I ran a background check on Karen Whitmore. She's made 17 complaints to various city departments in the past 2 years. Noise violations, building code infractions, tree trimming disputes, property line issues. But here's the interesting part. 12 of those complaints were against Marcus Chen. 12 complaints in 2 years? Everything from suspicious vehicle traffic to improper garbage can placement to disturbing the peace through loud phone conversations. The woman has been documenting his every move since the day he bought the house." Walsh was beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't a concerned neighbor reporting suspicious activity. This was a sustained harassment campaign that had escalated into false criminal accusations. But the legal reality was more complex than the obvious truth. Karen's obsessive documentation, however motivated by personal animosity, had created a paper trail that prosecutors would have to take seriously. In the current climate of heightened awareness about child abuse, even questionable accusations required thorough investigation. "What's our next move?" Gonzalez asked. "We verify everything. Contact the airline about Emma's travel plans. Get the hospital to release the complete medical records. Interview neighbors who might have witnessed the accident. Build an airtight case that proves this is harassment, not genuine concern." They returned to the interview room, where Marcus was explaining something urgently to his lawyer, while Torres took detailed notes. "Mr. Chen," Walsh said, sitting back down, "we've verified that your daughter is safe and that the hospital records support your account of the accident. However, we still need to address some inconsistencies in the timeline." Marcus looked hopeful, for the first time since his arrest. "What inconsistencies?" "Mrs. Whitmore claims you were active in your backyard until the early morning hours after the accident. Can you explain what you were doing?" The hope faded from Marcus's face. "I was cleaning. Emma had bled all over the pool deck, the ladder, everything. I couldn't leave it like that." "For 7 hours?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Walsh could see him struggling with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I kept seeing her fall. Over and over. I'd clean one area, then notice blood somewhere else, then remember how scared she looked when she hit her head. He looked up at Walsh with haunted eyes. I have PTSD from my deployment in Afghanistan. Traumatic events, they trigger episodes. I wasn't just cleaning, I was having flashbacks, panic attacks. I probably cleaned the same spots 20 times. Torres placed a protective hand on her client's arm. Detective, my client's medical records will confirm his PTSD diagnosis and current treatment. Walsh felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Marcus's suspicious behavior in the backyard, the pacing, the loud phone conversations, the obsessive post-accident cleanup, suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of someone struggling with trauma responses. But it also made him more vulnerable to false accusations. A man with documented mental health issues, recently divorced, acting erratically in his backyard late at night, it was exactly the kind of profile that could be twisted into something sinister by someone with malicious intent. Mr. Chen, we're going to need documentation of your PTSD treatment, but I want you to know that we've confirmed Emma is safe, and we're beginning to understand what actually happened here. The relief on Marcus's face was immediate and profound. Does this mean I can go home? Before Walsh could answer, there was a sharp knock on the door. Officer Reeves entered with an expression that made Walsh's stomach drop. Detective, we need to talk. Now. Walsh stepped back into the hallway, leaving Gonzalez with Marcus and Torres. What is it? She asked. Reeves looked deeply uncomfortable. The crime scene team found something in Chen's backyard, something that changes everything. Walsh felt her heart sink. What did they find? Buried plastic sheeting. Multiple layers wrapped around what appears to be clothing and personal items, hidden under the pool foundation. The words hit Walsh like a physical blow. Whatever Marcus, Chen's story was, whatever explanation existed for Karen Whitmore's obsessive surveillance, physical evidence changed everything. How deep? 3 feet down, directly under where the pool's main support was located. The plastic was weighed down with rocks, like someone was trying to make sure it stayed buried. Walsh's mind raced through the implications. If Marcus had buried evidence under his pool, then removing the pool would expose it, which meant either he was incredibly stupid or... Officer, she said slowly, when exactly did Mrs. Whitmore first report her concerns about Mr. Chen? Reeves consulted his notes. Her first official complaint was filed 6 days ago, but she called the tip line this morning when she saw him starting to dismantle the pool. 6 days ago, before Marcus had started the demolition project. Before, he would have known that buried evidence might be exposed, which meant either Marcus Chen was guilty of something terrible. The evidence bag sat on Detective Walsh's desk like a malignant tumor, its contents spread across the metal surface under harsh fluorescent lights. 3 layers of heavy plastic sheeting had been carefully unfolded to reveal their contents. A2A, child's pink swimsuit size 8, a pair of small sandals with butterfly decorations, a blood-stained towel, and most damning of all, a silver bracelet engraved with Emma in delicate script. Marcus Chen sat in the holding cell 2 floors below, officially arrested and charged with evidence tampering and child endangerment, with additional charges pending the outcome of the investigation. His lawyer, Rebecca Torres, had gone silent after seeing the evidence, her confident demeanor replaced by the grim calculation of someone preparing for an impossible defense. But Detective Walsh couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at the most elaborate frame job she'd encountered in 15 years of police work. The blood is definitely the kid's, Detective Gonzalez said, entering Walsh's office with lab results. DNA matched to the hospital samples from her accident last month. But here's what's interesting. The blood pattern on the towel doesn't match. What you'd see from a head injury. Walsh looked up from the evidence photos. Explain. Dr. Martinez at Riverside General sent over Emma's medical file. Head lacerations bleed profusely, but in specific patterns. Lots of volume, but relatively contained to the injury site. This towel shows blood drops in multiple locations, like it was deliberately spotted. Staged? That's my read. Someone took a bloody towel from the original accident and added more blood to make it look worse than it was. Walsh studied the towel. Again. Gonzalez was right. The staining was too uniform, too distributed. It looked like evidence that had been created rather than evidence that had occurred naturally. What about the plastic sheeting? That's where it gets really interesting. Gonzalez pulled out another report. The plastic is generic hardware store stuff, but it shows signs of recent burial. We're talking days, not months. The dirt displacement? Patterns suggest it was dug up and reburied recently. How recently? Based on soil compaction and weather patterns, probably within the last week. Walsh felt pieces clicking into place. The same week Karen Whitmore filed her first official complaint. There's more. Gonzalez sat down across from Walsh's desk. I got curious about Mrs. Whitmore's background, so I did some deeper digging. Turns out she's been involved in similar situations before. He opened a thick folder labeled Whitmore, Karen, Prior Incidents. 3 different cities over the past 15 years. Portland, Oregon in 2009, Denver, Colorado in 2014, Phoenix, Arizona in 2019. In each case, she made detailed allegations against neighbors involving child welfare concerns. Walsh's pulse quickened. What were the outcomes? Portland case was dismissed after investigation showed the neighbors' children were safe and healthy. Denver case resulted in a restraining order against Whitmore for harassment. Phoenix case. Gonzalez paused. Phoenix case ended with the neighbor family moving out of state after months of legal battles, even though no charges were ever filed. She's done this before. Gets better. Or worse, depending on your perspective. In Phoenix, the neighbor family's name was Rodriguez. They had a 7-year-old daughter named Sophia, who had a swimming pool accident that required hospital treatment. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. Karen Whitmore had a pattern of targeting single parents, particularly single fathers, who had children involved in accidents or injuries. She would then construct elaborate narratives of abuse and neglect, supported by obsessive documentation of normal parental behavior taken out of context. Mike, Walsh said slowly, I think we're looking at the wrong crime scene. What do you mean? We've been treating Marcus Chen's backyard as the scene of a crime against Emma Chen. But I think the real crime scene is Karen Whitmore's house, and the real victim is Marcus Chen. Walsh stood up and walked to her whiteboard, where she'd been mapping the timeline of events. Look at the sequence. Karen moves to Maple Street 3 years ago. The same time Marcus buys his house, she immediately begins documenting his activities through complaints to city departments. Then Emma has an accident that requires hospitalization, a genuine trauma that Karen witnesses. She drew connecting lines between events on the board. Instead of accepting that it was an accident, Karen constructs a narrative where Marcus is abusive. She begins more intensive surveillance, documenting every interaction he has with his daughter, every phone call, every moment of PTSD-triggered behavior. Gonzalez followed her reasoning. But she needs physical evidence to make her story credible. Exactly. So she plants evidence, items that would have legitimately existed after Emma's accident but wouldn't normally be buried. The swimsuit Emma was wearing, the towel used to clean up blood, even Emma's bracelet that might have been lost during the chaos. But how would she get access to those items? Walsh turned back to the evidence table. What if she didn't have to steal them? What if Marcus threw them away after the accident, traumatized and not thinking clearly, and Karen retrieved them from his trash? The scenario was disturbingly plausible. Marcus, dealing with PTSD flashbacks and the trauma of seeing his daughter injured, might have discarded anything that reminded him of that night. Karen, already conducting surveillance, could have easily gone through his garbage and collected items to use later. Then she waits, Walsh continued. She needs the perfect moment to discover the evidence. When Marcus applies for permits to remove the pool, she realizes this is her opportunity. She buries the evidence under the pool foundation and then reports suspicious activity right as he begins demolition. Gonzalez was nodding grimly, making it look like he's trying to destroy evidence when actually she's positioning it to be found. The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. She files her first official complaint exactly 6 days before the demolition begins. She makes her most serious allegations on the day he starts work. And now we conveniently find evidence buried exactly where the excavation would uncover it. Walsh felt the familiar surge of anger that came with realizing she'd been manipulated. Karen Whitmore hadn't just made false accusations. She'd constructed an elaborate crime scene designed to destroy an innocent man's life, but proving it would be nearly impossible. The evidence was real, even if it had been planted. The blood was Emma's, even if it had been manipulated. The timeline was suspicious, but not definitively criminal. "We need to search Karen Whitmore's house," Walsh said. "On what grounds? Conspiracy, to file false charges, evidence tampering, harassment." Walsh was thinking rapidly. If she planted evidence in Marcus's yard, she had to prepare it somewhere. She had to have tools, materials, maybe even more items she collected from his trash. Gonzalez looked skeptical. "A judge is going to want more than a theory to issue a search warrant." "Then we get more." Walsh grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. "I want to interview Karen Whitmore again, but this time I'm not asking about Marcus Chen. I'm asking about Portland, Denver, and Phoenix." As they drove toward Maple Street, Walsh couldn't shake the image of Marcus Chen sitting in his holding cell, completely bewildered by how his normal Saturday morning had become a nightmare. If she was right about Karen Whitmore, then an innocent man was facing potential decades in prison while his actual tormentor was probably at home, satisfied with her work. But if Walsh was wrong, if the evidence was genuine and Marcus Chen really had harmed his daughter, then she was about to let a dangerous criminal walk free while persecuting a concerned citizen. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Walsh was about to bet everything on her instincts about human nature, evidence patterns, and the disturbing psychology of someone who would destroy an innocent family to feed her need for control. As they pulled into Karen Whitmore's driveway, Walsh noticed that every window in the pristine white colonial was covered with closed blinds, unusual for the middle of the day in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the behavior of someone who didn't want to be observed while they were busy observing everyone else, or someone who was hiding something that could destroy the perfect facade they'd spent years constructing. Walsh rang the doorbell, her hand instinctively checking her service weapon, though she couldn't explain why she suddenly felt like she might need it. When Karen Whitmore opened the door, her satisfied smile from that morning was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Detectives," she said, her voice artificially bright. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon. Have you arrested him? Is the neighborhood finally safe?" But Walsh was looking past Karen into the house, where she could see something that made her blood run cold. Spread across Karen's dining room table were dozens of photographs, all taken with a telephoto lens through Marcus Chen's windows. Photos of him eating dinner alone, working on his computer, talking on the phone, even sleeping in his bedroom. Walsh realized she wasn't looking at the home of a concerned neighbor. She was looking at the command center of someone who had been conducting military-grade surveillance on Marcus Chen for months, documenting his every movement with the obsessive precision of someone planning the perfect crime. The question was whether Karen Whitmore was a master manipulator who had just been caught, or whether she genuinely believed her own delusi. The photographs covering Karen Whitmore's dining room table told a story of obsession so complete, so invasive, that Detective Walsh felt physically sick looking at them. Hundreds of images, organized by date and time, showing Marcus Chen in moments that no neighbor should ever witness. Showering, sleeping, eating, crying, during what were obviously private phone calls with his daughter. "Mrs. Whitmore," Walsh said carefully, stepping into the foyer without invitation, "we need to discuss your surveillance activities." Karen's eyes darted toward the dining room, and for the first time since this investigation began, Walsh saw genuine fear cross the woman's face. But instead of shame or embarrassment, Karen's expression shifted to something far more disturbing. The righteous indignation of someone who believed her criminal behavior was actually heroic. Surveillance? Karen straightened her shoulders, pulling her robe tighter around her thin frame. "I prefer to call it community protection. Someone had to document what that man was doing. Someone had to gather evidence." Detective Gonzalez moved to block the front door while Walsh approached. The dining room table. The scope of Karen's operation was staggering. Not just photographs, but detailed logs, audio recordings, and what appeared to be floor plans of Marcus's house with notations about his daily routines. "This isn't community protection," Walsh said, picking up a photograph that showed Marcus making breakfast in his kitchen, clearly taken from inside Karen's house with a powerful telephoto lens. "This is stalking. I was protecting that child." Karen's voice rose to a near shriek. "Everyone could see what kind of man he was, but nobody would listen, nobody would act. So I had to gather proof." Walsh studied the timeline Karen had created. The woman had been documenting Marcus's every movement for nearly 3 years, but the tone of her notations had shifted dramatically around the time of Emma's accident. Before September, the entries were petty complaints about noise levels and garbage can placement. After September, they became increasingly paranoid, describing normal parental behavior as suspicious and threatening. "Mrs. Whitmore," Gonzalez said, "you mentioned earlier that you heard Emma crying for help the night of her accident, but according to the hospital records, Marcus drove Emma to meet the ambulance at the end of the street. How could you have heard her crying if she wasn't at the house?" Karen's face flushed red. The sounds carry. Maybe it was earlier, before they left." But Walsh was looking at a different photograph, one that made her stomach turn. It showed Marcus's backyard, the morning after Emma's accident, clearly taken from an upstairs window in Karen's house. In the image, Marcus could be seen cleaning blood from the pool deck, his movements clearly visible through Karen's telephoto lens. Walsh held up the photograph. "You watched him clean up after his daughter's accident. You documented it. You turned a father's trauma response into evidence of a crime. He was destroying evidence." He was processing trauma. Walsh's professional composure finally cracked. "You watched a man dealing with the worst night of his life, and you decided it was entertainment." Karen's expression shifted again, and Walsh recognized the look. It was the same expression she'd seen on the faces of other delusional criminals when confronted with the reality of their actions. Not shame, not regret, but anger that their victims weren't properly grateful for their attention. "You don't understand," Karen said, her voice dropping to an eerie calm. "I saved that little girl. When I realized what he was going to do—" "What he was going to do?" Gonzalez interrupted. "Mrs. Whitmore, Emma Chen is alive and well in California. We verified this independently." "That's what you've been told." Karen smiled, and the expression was so disturbing that Walsh instinctively moved her hand closer to her weapon. "But I know what I saw. I know what really happened that night." Walsh felt pieces of a much darker puzzle falling into place. Karen hadn't just constructed false evidence against Marcus. She had constructed an entire alternate reality where she was the hero saving a child from a monster. The depth of her delusion was so complete that she genuinely believed her own fabricated story. "Mrs. Whitmore," Walsh said gently, "we need you to come to the station for questioning. There are some inconsistencies we need to resolve." "I'm not going anywhere." Karen's voice turned sharp, dangerous. Not until you arrest him properly. Not until you find her body." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Karen Whitmore wasn't just accusing Marcus Chen of child abuse. She was accusing him of murder, and she was so convinced of her delusion that she expected the police to keep searching until they found evidence of a crime that had never occurred. Walsh realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than a malicious neighbor. They were dealing with someone who had become so disconnected from reality that she might be capable of anything to prove her delusions were true. "Ma'am," Gonzalez said, "we've spoken directly with Emma Chen. She's alive. Children can be coached. Videos can be faked. You're not looking hard enough." Karen moved toward her kitchen, and Walsh noticed for the first time that the woman's hands were shaking, not with fear, but with what looked like excitement. The kind of adrenaline rush that came from believing you were finally going to be vindicated after months of being ignored. "Mrs. Whitmore, please step away from the kitchen." "I have more evidence," Karen said, opening a drawer. "Things I haven't shown you yet. Proof that will make you understand." Walsh's training kicked in. Something about Karen's demeanor had shifted into dangerous territory, the manic energy of someone who was about to do something desperate to prove their point. "Keep your hands visible, ma'am." But Karen was already pulling something from the drawer. Not a weapon, something wrapped in plastic, something small and metallic. "I found this in his garbage," Karen said, holding up what appeared to be a child's hair clip, the kind Emma might have worn. "The night after the accident, covered in blood." Walsh stared at the hair clip, her mind racing. If Karen had been collecting items from Marcus's trash for months, building a collection of evidence to support her delusions, then the buried plastic sheeting wasn't the end of her evidence tampering. It was just the beginning. "Ma'am, please place the item on the counter and step back." "You have to test it," Karen insisted, her voice becoming increasingly frantic. "The blood will match. It will prove everything I've been telling you." But Walsh was beginning to understand something that made her skin crawl. Karen hadn't just planted evidence in Marcus's yard. She had been collecting and potentially tampering with evidence for months, creating an entire archive of fabricated proof to support her delusions. The hair clip in Karen's hand might indeed have Emma's blood on it, blood from the genuine accident that Karen had witnessed and documented. But instead of recognizing it as evidence of an accident, Karen had preserved it as evidence of a crime that existed only in her imagination. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're under arrest for harassment, evidence tampering, and filing false reports. You're making a mistake." Karen's voice rose to a scream as Gonzalez moved to restrain her. "I'm trying to save her. Why won't anyone listen to me?" As they secured Karen in handcuffs, Walsh looked around the house that had served as a surveillance command center for 3 years. Every window facing Marcus's property was equipped with high-powered cameras. Every surface was covered with documentation of his daily life. Every room contained evidence of an obsession so complete that it had consumed Karen's entire existence. But most disturbing of all was the realization that Karen genuinely believed she was the hero of this story. In her delusional reality, she had spent 3 years trying to save a child from a monster, and the police were fools for not recognizing her heroism. As they led Karen to the patrol car, Walsh could see Marcus's house across the street. Crime scene tape still fluttered around his backyard, marking the spot where Karen's planted evidence had been discovered. An innocent man was sitting in a holding cell, his life destroyed by the delusions of someone who had convinced herself that stalking, harassment, and evidence tampering were acts of heroism. But Walsh also realized that Karen Whitmore's arrest was only the beginning of a much larger problem. The evidence Karen had planted was real, even if it had been manipulated. The photographs and recordings she'd collected were genuine documentation of Marcus's activities, even if her interpretation was delusional, proving that Karen had framed. Marcus would require demonstrating that a woman who genuinely believed in her own delusions had been capable of elaborate, premeditated deception. It meant convincing a jury that someone who appeared to be a concerned citizen was actually a master manipulator who had spent years constructing the perfect false accusation. As the patrol car carrying Karen Whitmore disappeared down Maple Street, Walsh stood in the driveway of the pristine white colonial, looking at the house that had served as the nerve center for the systematic destruction of an innocent man's life. Tomorrow, she would have to walk into a courtroom and explain how 3 years of obsessive surveillance, mountains of fabricated evidence, and the devastating false accusation of child murder had all grown from one simple, terrible seed, a neighbor who couldn't tolerate the idea that she wasn't in control of everyone around her. But tonight, Walsh had to figure out how to undo the damage Karen Whitmore had.